Alchemist Enigma. Vampire Dead-tective Book 5. Written by Flynn. Chapter 1. Darkness. That's all I knew during the day now. The energy transfer had sapped a lot of humanity from me, and I found it impossible to wake up any earlier than after the setting of the sun. Sometimes it was later than that. I never thought I'd hate sleeping in, but it wasn't much fun when you didn't have a choice. The transfer also left me exhausted for 2 nights after our ghostly devil adventure, but on the 3rd night I awoke feeling alive, or as alive as I ever felt. I swung my legs over the side of my bed, and ran a hand through my neat hair. The benefit to sleeping like the dead is you didn't move, so you didn't wake up with morning hair, or in my case evening hair. I glanced at the window, and through the thick curtains I could see it was pitch black outside. The sun had completely set at least 30 minutes before. I really missed that bright, blinding ball of burning mass. I got up and shuffled my way to the living room, where I found Vince on the couch. In his hand was the mysterious note from Tim. "Any luck figuring it out?" I asked him. He set the note on the coffin table, and shook his head. "None at all." I plopped myself beside him, and looked at the scrap of paper. "Where it began so shall it end," I read aloud. I furrowed my brow, and my eyes flickered to Vince. "So what we have to do is figure out where something began, and we'll find what he's been hiding from us," I guessed. "So it seems," Vince agreed. "Sounds easier than it is," I added as I picked up the paper. I turned over the scrap and sighed. Damn Tim and his riddles. He always did like trying to be smarter than everyone else in the room. Vince plucked the note from my fingers and stuffed it into his coat. I scowled at him. "Hey. I wasn't done not figuring that out. If you are rested enough, there is another who may know the answer to the riddle," Vince told me. I raised an eyebrow. "Who are you?" My eyes lit up. "Pat." "Yes. We have tried our wits against Tim's message, and found ourselves wanting. Perhaps Bat may have the answer. He knew Tim longer than I," Vince revealed. I jumped to my feet, grabbed Vince's arm and dragged him toward the door. "Then what are we waiting for? Let's get this riddle solved and finally find out what Tim's been hiding from us." We drove to the secret garage entrance into Bat's warehouse, but Vince slowed to a stop 50 yards from the wall that contained the hidden door. I glanced between Vince and the door. "What? The car gets scared or something?" I teased. His pursed lips and narrow eyes killed my merry mood. "There is something wrong." I followed his gaze to the wall, and noticed the slim outline of the entrance. That meant the door was slightly ajar. "Maybe the door needs some fixing," I suggested. Vince shook his head. "Bat would never tolerate anything broken, even in Tim's shop." I leaned against my seat and gestured to the road. "So what do we do? Sit here all night waiting for something to happen, or go find the trouble ourselves?" "We will find the trouble," Vince replied as he opened his door and hopped out. I joined him outside the car, and together we walked silently toward the ajar garage door. No lights shone through the thin windows, showing the lights in the garage were off. They'd never been off before except when trouble was afoot. Vince pressed his hand against an inconspicuous brick, and the stone sank an inch into the structure. The fake brick released a mechanism, and the garage door rose 2 feet before Vince released the brick and the door stopped. He led the way beneath the door, and into the dark shop. Our vampire eyes allowed us to see the interior, and it was a mess. I'm not talking the usual mess, but complete devastation. All the tools were scattered across the floor, and the pegboards were tossed into a pile of ruin. The disorderly piles of oil and gas were overturned, and their contents leaked across the floor. The stairs leading up to the loft were all broken, and the door that led to Bat's lab sat askew on its hinges. Did Bat decide to redecorate? I whispered to Vince. He shook his head. This was none of Bat's doing. He strode over to the askew door, and pulled it partly shut to show the back. Across the door was a long claw mark. I gasped. "Werewolves." "Undoubtedly," Vince agreed. He opened the door, and the entrance toppled off its hinges and clattered to the floor. We stepped into the lab, and I cringed when I saw the same destruction as in the garage. The tables were overturned, and the vials and beakers lay shattered on the ground. Papers, some half-burnt, lay in scattered piles, and there were long claw marks across the outer walls of the small white room. The door of the room was broken in half and lay in pieces just inside the entrance. Vince strode forward to the white room and I quickly followed. I listened for any sounds of danger, but heard nothing.
"You don't think they're still here, do you?"
I whispered to him. "No. The attack took place a few days ago," he told me. "How can you tell?" "By the canine scent of the werewolves." I lifted my nose into the air and wrinkled it. "They do smell like dogs," I commented. Vince went directly for the blood refrigerator and opened the door. "I know you're a vampire, but is this really the time?" I scolded him. Vince ignored me and grabbed the panel on the door. He wrenched the two parts of the door apart to reveal a small square secret compartment. I blinked at the hidden space as he snatched a slip of yellowed paper from its walls. "I've heard of strange diets, but hiding a piece of paper for eating later is a little ridiculous," I muttered. "If anything was to happen to him, he would leave a note here," Vince explained as he unfolded the aged, wrinkled paper. His frown deepened as his eyes brushed over the contents. I strode over to stand by his side. "What is it?" "He's not in trouble, is he?" "I'm not sure." "I can't read the message," Vince admitted. I glanced at the paper and raised an eyebrow. On the parchment was a bunch of squiggly lines and exclamation points.
"Oh, what language is this?"
"Gibberish."
"As far as I can surmise, yes," he replied.
My eyes flickered up to his serious face. "Seriously? You've known each other for how long, and you still can't read his handwriting?" "This is Bat's handwriting, but the language is not any I know of him using," Vince informed me. "So we don't really know if this is a secret message from him, or if we found his lost grocery list," I commented. Vince stiffened and his head whipped up. He stuffed the paper into his jacket and pursed his lips. "We should leave." I stiffened. His voice was stern and had a quick march to his words.
"What is it?" "We are not alone." I looked around the room. Nothing stirred except for a few slips of paper on the ground. "Well, you call the broken furniture company, sure, but..." It was but nothing for the shadows, as many of them warped into dark humanoid figures with glowing yellow eyes.
They were like the twisted shadows of dwarves, in that their arms and legs were impossibly long compared to their thin, short bodies. I gasped and stumbled back against Vince. He grasped my upper arms and held me still.
"What the hell are those?"
I asked him. "Doppelgangers employed by Ruthven. They are his most powerful creations aside from Field," Vince told me. The creatures stretched their shadowy legs toward us, and I cringed when I noticed their hands were curved like the talons of eagles.
"So why hasn't he used them before?"
I pointed out. "They will only deign to be summoned in the matters of the arcane," he explained.
"And that means what exactly?"
"They have been summoned to steal Bat away for some purpose."
"Aha! And how do we unsummon them?"
"There is no way but to defeat them with like magic," Vince told me. The creatures drew closer, and more slid from the wall behind the refrigerator door. They forced us into the center of the room, and stretched out their taloned hands toward us. You don't happen to have any in your coat, do you?" I squeaked.
"Not in my coat," he replied.
Vince held up his ring hand, and a brilliant light poured from the center crystal. The creatures threw their arms over their faces to block the light, and strangled cat-like screeches erupted from their throats. Vince swept me into his arms and shoved us through the doppelgangers that blocked the door. Literally through them. They were like the shadows they poured from, and when we swept through their bodies it was like being dunked in cold water. We sped into the main portion of the warehouse, to find the entire building was covered in the creatures. They hissed and slithered towards us on their long limbs. Vince raced us into the garage, but that too swarmed with the arcane creatures. The exit was blocked by the fiends. Their lithe bodies swayed to and fro as they walked toward us. Their numbers were a dozen deep as more poured from the shadows. Vince set me down and raised his ring above his head. The bright light shone across the room. The creatures the light touched disintegrated into tiny floating ashes. The light destroyed many of our foes, but not all of them. The doppelgangers at the front protected their brethren at the rear, and the lines continued to sway toward us. Vince turned to me. "Get on my shoulders and use your ring," he ordered me.
"But my life,"
I reminded him. "If I used the ring, my humanity would be sucked from me." "That is what is at stake," he argued. He knelt down, and I reluctantly climbed onto his shoulders. The action forced his ring hand lower, and the extent of the light dimmed. The doppelgangers rushed forward. Vince stood, and I was well above where his hand could reach. I lifted my ring as he did the same, and our combined lights burst forth and swept over the room. The creatures hissed, and retreated into the shadows from whence they came. In less than half a minute the room was empty except for us. Vince knelt down so I could climb off him. I stepped down, but a sudden wave of exhaustion swept over me. My legs buckled, and I fell forward. Vince caught me in his strong arms and pulled me against him. His worried face looked down at me, but I managed to smile back at him. "Remind me not to do that again anytime soon," I quipped. He didn't smile. "It may not be avoidable. If Ruthven is desperate enough to call forth so many doppelgangers, then he will use everything at his disposal to find Bat and ourselves." I rubbed my woozy head. What did he want Bat for, anyway?
"I mean, he's just a crazy old coot, isn't he?"
"Bat holds a great deal of Alchemist secrets that Ruthven would be very pleased to acquire," he told me. I pushed away from him, and raised an eyebrow. "Like what kind of secrets?" Vince held up one hand, and the ring on his finger glistened even in the dim light of the garage. "The secret to these." Chapter 2. I blinked at him.
"What does Bat know about these things?"
"That is, other than what you told him?" I wondered. "Bat has the knowledge to create them," Vince revealed. I furrowed my brow.
"Wait, so you gave him that knowledge, or did he learn that from the first guy who had the ring and made it?"
"He learned it himself," Vince corrected me. I tilted my head to one side and frowned. "I know my head's a little loopy right now, but didn't that alchemist guy who made the rings live a really long time ago?" 1,000 years, Vince confirmed.
"And that guy was?"
"He is Bat." I held up my hands. "Wait, so you're telling me that Bat is not only the 1,000-year-old alchemist who created these cursed rings, but that he kicked your ass enough to get you stuck to one?" The image of Bat duking it out with Vince and winning was too much. I burst out laughing. Vince scowled at me. "I see nothing humorous in your statement. Bat was a formidable foe in his youth, and still retains enough ability to keep the rings in existence." I froze and whipped my head up to him. "In existence?" I shoved my ring into Vince's face. "Are you telling me he's the only thing keeping this damn thing on my finger and killing me?" "It isn't killing you. You are changing into—" "Damn it, Vince, you know what I mean," I growled. Vince pursed his lips, but there was some pity in his eyes. "It is only speculation, but the rings may cease to exist after his death," he guessed. I shut my eyes and clasped my hands around the ring. "So if Bat dies, we're both free," I muttered. "Don't travel down that path, Liz. There is only regret there," Vince advised. I opened my eyes and frowned at Vince.
"Why shouldn't I think about this?"
"You both know I'm dying." "Becoming a vampire," he corrected me. I straightened and glared at my partner. "You both know my life is draining from me, and neither of you are doing much to stop it, so why shouldn't I think about him dying?" "We warned you about using the ring," he reminded me. I turned away from him and paced the floor in front of him with my hands in fists at my sides. "And you think that was enough when Bat could have just said, 'Oops, my bad'? It's because of me you're in this mess." I shot back. "Wish him dead if you will, but do not kill him yourself," Vince ordered me. I stopped and towered before Vince in all my short height. How many times did you wish Tim was dead or that I was dead? It's no different. I bet you even thought about killing Bat. I argued.
Yes, I did, but he still lives, Vince countered.
I started back and furrowed my brow. My voice refused to go above a whisper, as I wondered aloud the question that begged to be asked.
Then why didn't you?
Why didn't you sneak up on him and drain all his blood? You could have been free. Bat was a worthy opponent, and Vince clenched his teeth and partially turned away from me. I stepped up to him and clasped his chin between my fingers. I pulled him toward me, but his glasses blocked my view. I reached up and pulled them off, so his beautiful red eyes looked into mine. Vince looked aged and tired. And what? I persisted. He was the only constant. Yes, I could have killed him when he passed the ring on to Tim, but we both knew we needed each other to keep our sanity against the changing world around us, Vince explained. I slid my fingers from Vince's chin, but didn't release his eyes from my firm gaze.
So you would have missed him, and vice versa?
I guessed. Vince gave a nod.
Yes, we were. We were as two children afraid to blow out the candle of life of the other.
Bat too had every opportunity to destroy me, but he refused. Vince chuckled, but there was no mirth in the sound. He compared killing me to destroying his last bit of humanity. The last bit of soul that remained before he immersed himself in alchemy. Now I felt like an ass. Vince, I am sorry. I didn't know he was that important to you. Sure, you guys bantered, but I just thought he was an old friend like Tim. Vince straightened and gathered his emotions.
Yes, well, now you know the full truth between Bat and myself.
What choice will you make? Will you help me find him, or will you? I whacked his arm as hard as I could, and he flinched. I folded my arms across my chest and glared at him. After hearing that story, do you really think I'm going to stand around here and see if Ruthven kills Bat? He opened his mouth, but I held up a finger. The answer is hell no, so where do we start figuring out this note puzzle so Bat can tell us about Tim's note puzzle? Vince smiled and pulled out the yellowed sheet. He wrote the note on an ancient piece of parchment. There may be something important in the words, the ink, or even the paper itself.
Like something to do with alchemy?
I asked him.
That may be. So you know anything about alchemy?
Because I sure don't. Heck, I couldn't even pass chemistry, I quipped. Vince pocketed the note and shook his head. No. Bat didn't wish to kill me, but he didn't trust me enough to reveal his alchemy secrets to me, or anyone else. However, he isn't the only alchemist in the city. So we go to an alchemist place like Vera set up for witches, and pick a name off the list. I suggested. Alchemists are more suspicious of one another, and refuse to create guilds or groups. They are also very skilled at hiding their occupation, and only boast when they have reached a great discovery, so they are not easy to find. However, we may find some information from Mitch, he told me. I snorted.
I just hope we have enough money to pay him.
We barely got him to help us last time, and that was because we paid him back with his life, I reminded him. We could always offer to deprive him of the same if he refuses to cooperate, Vince mused.
Let's try the money first and see where we go from there, I advised.
I glanced around the dark ruined building and sighed.
I just hope we get to Bat before those doppelgangers do.
Vince led me through the mess and back to our car. Bat has survived this long. He would not allow himself to be taken by shadow fiends, he told me. So if alchemists are all secretive, then how does Ruthven know about Bat being this all-powerful alchemist anyway? I asked him as I followed his long strides. Ruthven himself is an old alchemist, and regretfully he is well read on their lore and hierarchy, Vince explained. He learned about Bat and the rings from ancient texts, and has searched for Bat for several centuries. Why? I mean, he's lived that long without anybody's help, why does he want Bat? I wondered. We reached the car, and Vince took the wheel while I slid into my usual seat. Bat has performed countless experiments with alchemy, and the side effect has been to infuse his blood with pure magic. It has extended his life, and even a drop of such blood would give the drinker magical powers beyond compare, though the effect would only last for a limited time. Bat always feared he would be captured and his blood drained from him and replenished, only to be drained again.
I cringed. That's really sick. Ruthven is such a creature.
I furrowed my brow, as my mind brought forth a memory. Wait a sec, didn't I take some of Bat's blood? You know, the second time we were here? Vince shook his head. No. Bat has always been careful about his blood, and has created a shell around his body that is made of false blood. It was that which you tapped into in your feeding.
That sounds like some serious alchemy.
So Ruthven wants Bat's blood because it's all magical and stuff? What's the magic do? I asked him. Vince nodded at my ring. That magic Ruthven seeks, a sort of immortality with unlimited power, is the same that powers our rings because one half of the blood inside the rings is Bat's. The other half of the blood fusion is mine, which he used to strengthen our bond. I looked down at my ring and cringed. You mean I've been carrying around your guy's blood all this time?
That's kind of nasty.
Vince smiled as he backed us out and drove down the road. Through all of our adventures, you find that idea detestable? I waved the ring at him.
Yeah, because this thing's kind of stuck to me.
At least with anything else I could always wash it off. Vince's smile faltered and he punched the gas pedal.
That problem may well be solved if Bat dies, he mused.
I cringed. And if it doesn't? If these rings don't die with him? Then you remain in the same fate as you are now. I slumped in my seat as we barreled down the road. So I have to hope Bat dies, but I don't want him to die, but then I'll be a vampire, which is kind of cool, except for the whole blood-sucking thing. I ran a hand down my face and sighed. Man, this really sucks, and not the vampire kind of suck.
The night isn't over yet, he reminded me.
I snorted. Thanks, I needed that pick-me-up. You're welcome. I think you're annoying. I will take that as a compliment. You would. Now let's get this visit to Mitch over with. The eyeball in that place gives me the creeps. Chapter 3. We arrived at our regular sewer hole, and dropped into the darkness of the dank, smelly sewers. Vince held his arm out in front of me so I wouldn't pass him. He himself stood still, and his eyes swept over the area. What? Something wrong? I asked him. With Ruthven desperate to capture Bat and us, we must be vigilant, he told me. So watch out for shadows that aren't ours? I guessed. Vince nodded. Yes. He will continue to loose his doppelgangers on us. Just as long as he doesn't loose them too often, or I'm going to be a vampire before sunrise, I quipped.
Would that be so bad?
Vince mused. I looked up at him, but he had his face turned away from me. I'm kind of trying to avoid that fate right now, at least until we're not having people trying to kill us. Vince dropped his arm and strode forward. The way is safe. I neither smell nor hear anything amiss. I hurried after him and scrutinized his face. His lips were pursed together, and his dark glasses partially hid his eyes. So you're kind of stuck on this whole me becoming a vampire thing. Are you wanting me to become one? No. You ever thought about having a vampire partner?
Yes.
With me? No. With Tim? Perhaps. I rolled my eyes. Come on, it had to be Tim. I mean, who else has had the ring besides me, Bat and Tim? I paused and frowned. Actually, who has had the ring? Merely you three and myself with my own, he told me.
So Bat gave the ring to Tim.
Why? I wondered. Only Bat knows the answer to your question. He would not divulge that information to me, and the exchange took place while I was asleep, Vince replied.
So you were Tim's partner for what?
200 years. How come in all that time he didn't become a vampire, and I've got one foot in the grave after a couple of months? I asked him. You have used your ring excessively. To survive, I argued as we walked through the tunnel of torches. Vince shook his head.
The reasons are unimportant.
My changing into a human also assisted in your hurried depletion of humanity. When you used the ring on field, you worsened the situation greatly. I glared at him. Maybe I shouldn't have saved a certain vampire from certain doom. As I said before, the reasons are unimportant. The uses drained your humanity to the point of undeath, and nothing but freedom from the ring or complete death can change your fate, he insisted.
You're just full of good news today.
Next you're going to tell me that Ruthven's following our trail with his werewolves. Actually, I have that news, a voice spoke up. I started and jumped into Vince's arms. He caught me and turned us to a shadowy figure that emerged from the darkness. Officer Romero, zombie cop for the para squad.
And it's worse than that.
He has doppelgangers. We have already fought many of them, Vince finished for Romero as he set me down. Then you know how dangerous this is, and how dangerous you're making it for everyone else, Romero mused. I frowned at him. Dangerous for everybody else? We're the ones being chased by shadows and dog-breathed monsters. He turned his narrowed eyes on me. Ruthven doesn't care who gets in his way, and his lapdogs don't discriminate between those they're tracking and innocent bystanders. They've been attacking anyone who comes through these tunnels, even members of my squad. We can't help who Ruthven chooses to attack, Vince argued. He tried to step past Romero, but the zombie held out one of his rotting arms. Maybe you can't help there, but you can help me with info. Why the hell is he causing this much trouble now? What did you do to tick him off so much? Romero questioned us. This isn't your fight, Vince argued. Like hell it isn't. Ruthven's making this everybody's fight, what with those werewolves crashing the tunnels and those black books he put on the market, he growled.
But we stopped those, I defended us.
We might have stopped the manufacturing, but there's still a whole bunch out there causing trouble, he pointed out. If you wish for the trouble to stop, then let us proceed, Vince commanded him. Romero frowned.
Why shouldn't I just drag you to headquarters and see what I can get out of you?
That'd be a lot less trouble for me than letting you two cause trouble around the sewers. The more time we waste here, the more time Ruthven has to find what he is searching for, Vince told him.
And what is he looking for?
Romero persisted. I shrugged. We honestly don't know, but we do know it's why Tim was killed. Romero's foggy eyes flickered between us. He sighed and lowered his arm as he shook his head. I suppose I owe you guys big time for saving my skin back there, even if I did let you borrow my dog. However, if I hear one bit of trouble and you two are involved, I'm hauling your asses down to headquarters for that info, got it? I saluted him.
Got it.
Romero stepped aside and jerked his head down the tunnel. Get on then and don't cause trouble down here. We've got our hands full of hairballs as it is. We strode past the zombie cop and down the lit tunnels to the lights at the end. I glanced over my shoulder and saw that Romero had already disappeared.
Sounds like Ruthven's getting desperate to find what we're looking for, I whispered to Vince.
And Bat, Vince reminded me.
You think Bat's down here?
I asked him. There's that chance. Bat had a great many hiding areas he spoke of to me, but there were also many he kept to himself, Vince told me.
So we can't just go searching for him in all the places you know?
I surmised.
That's correct.
My shoulders slumped and I sighed.
Of course that would make this too easy.
We reached the end of the tunnel, and the mouth opened to the underground city of the supernaturals. Something was off. Rather than the usual booming business of witches, hags, zombies and mummies walking to and fro for their shopping, there was only emptiness. The streets were nearly deserted. Only a few stragglers scurried from shop to shop in search of essentials. Vince didn't miss a stride, but walked through the emptiness. I stuck close to him and turned my head from side to side. Things must be worse than Romero said, I whispered. They sensed the presence of the doppelgangers, Vince explained. My eyes widened, and I stepped closer to him. So they're here? I asked him. No, but they have been, and may return. Small comfort. We reached the boo bar and stepped inside. The tables were empty, and the bartender was gone, but our old friend and informant Mitch sat at his usual table. He looked up at us as we approached and frowned. "You guys are way too predictable." They counted on that. A dozen howls erupted behind us, and we spun around in time to see twice that many werewolves burst through the front doors of the establishment. Their clawed feet skidded on the linoleum, but the momentum of their entrance slid them towards us. Vince grabbed the nearest tables and slid them into the path of the oncoming hairballs. The front wolves collided with the tables and rolled across the tops. Their brethren at the rear collided into them and tumbled in a doggy pile on the floor. Vince grabbed my hand, and we raced to the side door that led to Mitch's office. That direction was cut off when another 24 werewolves burst through the doors and stood in the doorframe. Their teeth glistened in the dim light of the swinging lamps, and their yellow eyes called for murder. We stopped and turned around. The other werewolves climbed to their feet and snarled at us as they clacked towards us. Behind the hairballs, I could make out the shadowy forms of doppelgangers. They brought up the rear at both exits. We were surrounded.
"Sorry about this, guys."
"They made me do it," Mitch spoke up.
"That makes us feel a lot better," I snapped at him as Vince and I backed up against his table.
A sly smile slid onto Mitch's lips. "If it makes you feel any better, this was a trap for them too." Mitch raised his hand and snapped his fingers. A quiet rumble arose around us, and the ground beneath our feet began to shake. There was a loud crack as something broke through wood. I turned my eyes to the front wall of the bar. My eyes widened as I beheld the large eye push forth from the wall, and bring with it a massive body clothed in a toga. The eyeball was a cyclops, and its body was a bundle of muscles that looked like it was constructed of rock. Its shoulders squeezed through the small hole that once held its eye, and fissures ran along the walls on either side of it. Plaster fell from the ceiling, and the werewolves yipped and scattered. The eyeball was ready. It snatched the werewolves with its large hands and tossed them into its wide mouth. They howled and screamed on the way down, and some clung to the rotten teeth. The cyclops smashed their hands, and they fell back into the abyss of its gullet. Those werewolves still on the ground entered full panic mode. We hit the back wall near Mitch's table to avoid the panic, as the werewolves raced to the windows and tumbled over each other to escape through the doors. It was a massive pile-up of hairball traffic, and the cyclops gobbled down dozens of them before the survivors were able to escape. The werewolves crashed into their shadowy accomplices outside the establishment, and scattered the darkness to the four winds of the underground complex. The whole episode was over in a minute. Only we remained in the ruins of the bar, and all was quiet. The lamps swung precariously from the ceiling, and cast strange shadows over the cyclops and Mitch's face. Mitch waved his hand at the lights, and the cyclops arrested their swinging with his hands.
"That's better."
"Those damn lights were making me sick," he commented. How? What? When? I choked out. Mitch stood and chuckled. "You really thought an eyeball inherited this place?" he asked me. I pointed a shaking finger at him.
You're the owner of the Boo Bar?"
He spread his arms and grinned. "Guilty as charged." I shook myself from my shock and gestured to the cyclops.
"Well, in a crazy world like this, having an eyeball own a place didn't sound that impossible," I argued.
Mitch nodded at the cyclops, who blinked back at us. "He's my employee, or to be more specific, the business security."
"Then how come he missed those demons the last time we were here?"
I pointed out. He shrugged. "Nobody's perfect. Besides, he's used only to clean up the big messes, and those werewolves were a big mess."
"What did they promise you in return for your help?"
Vince questioned him. "My life, and a chance at a little spot of my own after Ruthven's takeover of the city," Mitch told him. "Ruthven's takeover? Is that all this is about? Him trying to take over the city?" I spoke up. Mitch frowned at me. "First the city, then the world. The werewolves hinted that he had big plans, but they needed you guys to achieve them." "Did they mention anything about an alchemist?" Vince asked him. Mitch shook his head. "No, nothing that particular, only that they wanted you two alive. He leaned towards us and scrutinized our faces.
So what is this about anyway?
The whole story, I mean. Ruthven's not just looking for you two so he can have a nice, friendly chat. That is our concern. What we need from you is a reading of this. Vince pulled out the weathered slip of paper. Mitch took it in hand and raised an eyebrow.
This is some seriously old paper, and infused with magic to boot.
Where'd you get it?
What can you tell us about the writing?
Vince persisted. Mitch turned the paper around in a circle and shrugged.
Nothing except that it looks like it's in some sort of alchemist code.
I'm no good with that lingo, but I know a guy who might help you. His eyes flickered to us and a smile slid onto his lips. That is for a price.
How much?
Vince wondered. Mitch shook his head and tapped his temple.
Not that kind of price.
I want info, good info. Like what's Ruthven after? Do you wish to have more dealings with werewolves and doppelgangers? Vince asked him. Mitch snorted and gestured to the establishment. You kidding me? This mess is going to cost me a fortune. Vince stepped up to him and his sunglasses slipped down his nose. His eyes looked into Mitch's own and Mitch stiffened. Then you will tell us who is able to read the note on this paper. Mitch's voice held a mechanical tone and his words were flat. His name is Malachi. He resides on 32 Sunnyside Drive. Vince pushed his glasses over his eyes and broke contact. Mitch clutched his head and swayed side to side. He ground his teeth together, and one eye opened to glare at Vince. You asshole. You hypnotized me. Vince pulled a wad of dough from his jacket and tossed it on the table beside Mitch. I saved your life this day. What you ask is for more trouble than even your Cyclops can handle. You could have just asked nicer. Mitch argued. Vince turned and strode through the mess of the bar and out the front door. I shrugged and sheepishly smiled at Mitch.
Sorry about that.
We'll tell you later, I promised as I turned to follow Vince. At least, I hoped there would be a later. Chapter 4. I caught up to Vince outside the wrecked establishment. The exterior was unharmed by the fight, and only the claw marks on the ground from the werewolves told the tale of trouble. The underground city was now completely deserted, and our footsteps echoed eerily across the whole of the place. Sunnyside Drive. That actually sounds like a nice place, I mused to my partner. We shall see, Vince mused as he led us to the tunnel. Unfortunately, we had a bit of a problem. At the mouth of the tunnel stood Romero and half a dozen para-squad officers. Romero folded his arms and glared at us.
What the hell did you guys do now? We didn't do anything.
It was the werewolves and the Cyclops, I protested. Romero raised an eyebrow. I warned you two not to cause trouble, and with a story like that it sounds like you made a lot of it, and in record time. Now why don't you just follow me to headquarters, and I'll get my men on seeing what trouble you caused in the boo bar. We're in a hurry and don't have time for that, Vince argued. He tried to push his way past, but Romero put a hand on Vince's chest and held him back.
Not this time, Vincent.
This time you do what I say and tell me what the hell is going on, Romero insisted. Vince's hand whipped up and grabbed Romero's arm. The vampire tore the arm from its socket, and socked Romero in the face with his own hand. Romero stumbled back from the double blow. 2 men caught him, and the other 4 dove at us. Vince ducked the first swings and stood to catch the lead zombie by the chest. He lifted the officer, and threw him into the others. Vince grabbed my hand and yanked me back to the boo bar. I glanced over my shoulder in time to watch Romero put his remaining fingers to his lips, and blow. A shrill clear whistle rang through the complex, and a dozen more para-squad officers spilled from the headquarters down the street on the lower level. Romero pointed at us. Get them, he shouted. The zombies were faster than they looked as they sped towards us. Others climbed the front wall of their station like spiders to reach the upper level, where stood the entrance to the boo bar. Vince pulled me up the stairs at a speed that nearly swept my feet from the ground. We reached the boo bar with zombies at our heels and beside us, and we burst through the doors with the crowd behind us. The Cyclops had returned to its wall watching, and Mitch sat at his usual table counting the roll of bills given to him by Vince. At our entrance he jumped to his feet and pocketed the money. "Haven't you given me enough trouble?" he complained as we sped through the broken tables.
"Just passing through," I quipped as we passed by him and through the rear exit.
Once in the hall, Vince tossed me ahead of him and rammed his shoulder against the door. The metal door bent inward and jammed into the door frame. The zombies hit the door a millisecond after Vince, and the door gave a quarter of an inch. They slammed again, and it gave a little more. "We haven't much time," Vince warned me as he grabbed my hand and dragged me down the dank sewer tunnel.
"Should we really be doing this?
I mean, what's the harm in telling Romero everything we know?"
"What's he going to do, help us?"
I pointed out. "Ruthven has spies everywhere, even among the parasquad. Whatever we would learn he would learn," Vince argued. I heard a heavy clamor of metal against metal, and glanced over my shoulder. The door lay against the opposite wall with the frame, and zombies poured from the exit. They rushed down both ends of the tunnel, and a shout from the group going our way alerted the others which direction we headed. My heart skipped a beat when Vince slowed, and the distance between us and our pursuers decreased by half. I turned my gaze to him.
"What I didn't get to finish before he swept me into his arms. "Hold on to me," he ordered me.
"What Again I wasn't able to finish my sentence when he leaned forward. I saw his ring shine and our speed increased tenfold. The walls passed like smears of paint on a modernist piece of art. The wind whipped my hair into my face like small strands of thick chains and pelted my skin like stinging bees. I turned away from the front, and chanced a glance over Vince's shoulder. The zombies fell far behind, and in a few seconds they completely disappeared. Vince turned corners so sharply that I was nearly given whiplash. I buried my face into his jacket, and prayed the trip would soon end. In a few minutes, Vince slowed and stopped beneath the light of a manhole cover. A metal ladder with wet rungs led up the wall and to the cover. Vince set me down, and my legs wobbled at the lack of speed. The light from his ring dimmed to nothing. I leaned against the wall near the ladder and steadied myself.
"Not to complain or anything, but that was really fast," I commented.
"A necessity, considering the situation," he countered as he grasped the lower rungs of the ladder.
"Now we climb."
I grabbed his arm and nodded in the direction we'd come.
"Wait a sec.
If you were always able to do that speed, then why didn't you before?" I questioned him. "The need is greater now than before, and the effort drains my energy and forces me to find sustenance," he explained. I cringed. "So you're telling me it makes you really hungry?"
"Yes, but we haven't time for talking."
He climbed the ladder and I followed him. Vince opened the cover and slipped out. I peeked my head over the rim, and saw we were in a nice clean part of the city. Suburbia was upon us, and I breathed deeply of its ordinariness. There were repaired sidewalks on either side of the road, and the white houses sat in neat little rows. The lit streetlights illuminated the road, sidewalks and front walks, and the late hour meant the streets were deserted. Cars were parked along the curbs, prepared and waiting for the drive to work the next morning.
"I never thought I'd see something this ordinary again,"
I muttered as I pulled myself out of the hole. Vince slipped the cover back on, and looked over the area. "Sunnyside Drive should be near here," he informed me. I raised an eyebrow, and let my eyes sweep over the normalness. Could an alchemist really be hiding in a place like this? I mean, everybody else in the supernatural world seems to prefer the dark, icky places of the city. Then the normal living parts would be an excellent place to hide, Vince pointed out. He strode down the sidewalk and I followed his long strides. "So if alchemists are one step away from being hermits, how are we going to convince this one to help us?" I asked him. "We shall see what the alchemist demands when we meet," Vince advised.
"So winging it again?"
"Seems to work out for us most of the time," I mused. We walked a couple of blocks until Vince stopped at a pair of street signs signaling the names. I looked up and saw we were at the intersection of Sunnyside Drive and Happy Trail Street. Okay, that's a little too normal, I commented. Vince didn't reply, but his eyes swept over the area. The houses were still around us, but across the intersection sat a large, low building in the shape of a capital L. There was a small park in the front, and in the crux of the L was a pair of doors that led into a lobby. I noticed a sign at the front of the park, and against the sidewalk. Sunnyside Drive Retirement Community. I blinked and turned to Vince.
We're looking for an old guy?
So it appears, he mused. Like a senile old guy, or one who can actually help us? I asked him. We will find our answer inside, he replied as he strode forward. I hurried after him, and gestured to the dark building.
Yeah, but what room is he in?
There's probably dozens in there, I pointed out. We will ask the front desk, he suggested. The only lights in the dark building were in the halls and the front lobby. We reached the pair of glass doors and Vince tried one of the handles. Locked. A middle-aged woman sat behind the curved front desk, with her eyes glued to the pages of a romance novel. At the shake of the door she looked up and frowned.
We're closed to visitors, she called to us. But we really need to see someone, I called back.
The woman set down her novel and stood.
I'm afraid that's quite impossible.
Visiting hours are over, so please leave before I call the police, she ordered us. Vince stepped close to the glass doors and his glasses slid down his nose. I looked from him to where he was staring at, which was the woman behind the desk. She stiffened, and her eyes took on a vacant expression. The woman walked around the desk and to the doors. She pulled out her keys, unlocked the doors and opened them. Vince pushed past her and I slid inside behind him. My vampire companion turned to the woman, as she let the door shut behind us. We need to know if there is an alchemist residing here, Vince told her. The woman shook her head.
There are no alchemists.
Are any of the residents allowed special liberties? He asked the woman. She nodded.
Yes.
Mr. Wilson is allowed a dirt box of flowers. Mrs. Hammond is allowed her 5 shelves of mystery books, Mr.
Are any of them allowed chemistry sets? He specified. Yes, Mr. Merlin. Which room is his?
She nodded at the hall behind us and to our right. He's down there, room 42. Return to your duties and warn us if you notice anything unusual, Vince instructed her. The woman bowed her head and resumed her position behind the desk. Vince walked down the hall and I by his side. So do you think this alchemist is dangerous? I whispered. We will see. Chapter 5. We walked down the hall past the doors of the inmates' rooms. 38, 39, 40, I counted up. 41, 43. I stopped and glanced between the last 2 counts. Still no 42. I pointed at the doors. Vince. There's no room 42. The woman's as senile as the inmates. Vince passed me and stood before the empty wall between the 2 existing rooms. My flummoxed partner pursed his lips together, and his red eyes examined the barrier before him. Vince raised hand so his fingers were outstretched and his palm faced the wall. He pressed his palm against the wall. I started when a room door appeared in front of us. On the door was the number 42. Vince lowered his hand.
It seems we're expected, he mused. This doesn't seem like a good thing, I commented.
We will see. Can't we know something for once? I pleaded. Vince tried the knob. It turned and he pushed the door open. It swung into the room and revealed a small square suite. The first room was a small living room large enough for a love seat, chair and TV stand. Against the far right were 2 doors, one leading to a bathroom, and the other I guessed was a bedroom. There wasn't any sign of the chemistry set, or anything that screamed alchemist. In the living room chair sat a wizened old man who appeared to be 100. He had thick spectacles on his face, thinning white hair on his head, and a white shirt and faded jeans on his body. His eyes were closed, and a bit of drool dribbled from his mouth down to his chin. His chest rose up and down in a deep, even movement. I tiptoed inside, but Vince strode forward and stopped in front of the old man. Vince pulled out the slip of paper and held it out to him. We wish to have this deciphered, he told the inmate. The man didn't respond. I frowned and slunk over to my partner. The old man didn't move a muscle, as I turned to Vince and gestured at the stranger. Are you sure this is an alchemist? He doesn't seem very well lively, I pointed out. Then we will change that, Vince suggested. He pocketed the note, leaned down and knocked the old man's head off his shoulders. I screamed, but Vince wrapped an arm around me and slapped his hand over my mouth.
Quiet or you will wake others, he ordered me.
I pulled his hand from my mouth and pointed at the head.
You just killed a man.
I hissed.
This is not a man but a dummy, he argued.
And it was a good one until you wrecked it, a voice piped up. The bedroom door opened, and the same wizened old man with head shuffled out. He leaned on a cane and glared at us, as he pointed the bottom of his stick at the head and body. You'd better be willing to pay for those damages. My eyes whipped between the old man and the old man's son's head.
What the hell is going on here?
I questioned them. The thing in the chair was merely an elaborate decoy, a simple trick of air and materials, Vince explained. Simple? This isn't anything simple, the old man argued. He shuffled over to the head and picked it up. Just the head took weeks to sculpt, and even longer to order the materials and get them through those idiot women who run this place. Vince released me and walked over to the old man. Mr. Lynn stretched himself up to his full height of 5 feet and glared at the vampire. We need your help, Vince told him. And why should I help you, vampire? Your kind are nothing but trouble for my profession, always mocking us with your almost immortality and spoiling our experiments. The old man held up the head as proof. One of your own is in grave danger, Vince replied. Lynn snorted and half-turned from Vince. So? What do I care? Less competition for me. It is Frederick Bartholomew. Lynn froze and his head whipped around. His eyebrows crashed down and he pursed his lips.
What was that name, vampire?
Frederick Bartholomew. Lord Ruthven hunts him, Vince told him. Ruthven? What's that idiot doing now? Lynn growled.
Trying to take over the city, I spoke up.
Lynn snorted. Just like that fool to destroy something first and try to take over it later, like a wild dog that craps on a yard and later rolls in the grass.
So does that mean you'll help us?
I asked him. Help you? Hell no. These idiots can duke it out between each other for all I care. He paused and his eyes flickered between Vince and the ring on the vampire's finger. That is, unless you can spare a drop of Bartholomew's blood. We have nothing to give you but a challenge between alchemists, Vince replied. He pulled out the yellowed paper and held the words towards Lynn. Bartholomew created this code. Do you know what this says? Lynn sneered and waved a hand at the paper.
What kind of a challenge is that?
Give me a real challenge and, he paused and leaned towards the paper. His eyes squinted, and he grabbed a bottom corner.
What do we have here?
A spell with a bit of strange ink. Lynn pulled the paper from Vince's willing hand and studied the writing. He shuffled towards the bathroom and mumbled to himself. Maybe, just maybe it might be it, but my God, this is old, very old. I haven't seen this in ages.
What is it?
I asked him. Lynn paused in the bathroom door and glanced up at me with a scowl. Maybe a challenge, maybe nothing. Let me step into my office and see what I can find. He closed the door behind himself, and his mumblings were heard through the door. There came the sounds of chinking as glass tapped against glass, followed by a soft bubbling noise. I slid over to Vince and lowered my voice. You think this guy is really going to help us? I whispered.
Yes.
I frowned at him. Why? Because an alchemist cannot resist a challenge from another of his profession, and Bat is a legend in the Alchemist Society. It would raise Lynn's prestige if he could break the code, Vince explained.
So we're hoping this is going to stroke his ego enough to...
Eureka! Came a shout from the bathroom. The door burst open, and Lynn stood in the doorway waving the paper in one hand. Behind him was the messiest bathroom I'd ever seen, made possible by the large chemistry set that stretched across the small counter, and included the bathtub and the open, filthy toilet. The walls were stained with all the colors of the rainbows, as were the beakers and tubes that sat and lay on the counter, on shelves on the walls and on the floor. "I've got it!" Lynn shouted. "You solved the writing already?" I asked him. He hobbled towards us and scowled at me. "You doubt the great Lynn's abilities?" I shook my head. No, I was just maybe." I squeaked. Lynn shoved the paper under my nose.
"Well, I have here proof of my success."
"Take that, Bartholomew." Vince blessedly took the paper before it cut my lip, and peered over the contents. He raised an eyebrow, and his eyes flickered to Lynn. "I see only smears where there was once writing," he told the old man. My mouth fell open, and I stood on my tiptoes for a view. Sure enough, the gibberish was gone, and in their places were long smears of ink. I whipped my head to Lynn. "You ruined it." I growled at him.
"I have not. Let me take a look."
Lynn snatched the document from Vince and looked it over. Damn spell was stronger than I thought. "Hold this." He stuffed the paper into Vince's hands, and hurried to the bathroom. Lynn snatched a vial from the counter and hurried back to us. The old goat used a simple trick, but not simple ink. This is rare stuff from Egypt. I haven't seen the like in 100 years.
"Now hold open that paper, that's it."
"Now hold still." Vince held the paper so the smeared words faced the ceiling. Lynn splashed the paper with a little of the contents of the vial. My eyes widened when I beheld the ink swirl and reform. The smears changed to letters, and the letters formed words to create a note. Vince tilted the paper and silently read the note. He finished and frowned.
"Well, what does it say?"
I asked him. Vince's gaze turned to Lynn. "Did you read the contents?" he asked the old man. Lynn grinned and showed off the few teeth left in his head.
"Yep.
Every word is as clear as day, I made sure of that." Vince tilted his head down and his glasses slid down his nose. He made eye contact with Lynn, but the old man just glared at him. "Don't you go trying that stupid vampire stuff on me. I've made sure I'm guarded against something as stupid as hypnosis." Vince frowned and raised his head till his glasses slipped back into place. "I see," he commented as he stuffed the document into his jacket.
"What of your shoelaces?"
"My shoelaces?" Lynn returned. He glanced down at his feet. "I'm wearing slippers, you." Vince dove forward and sank his teeth into the old man's wrinkled neck. Lynn's eyes widened, and the old man's scream came out as a garbled gasp. His cane clattered to the ground, and his hands flailed in the air above him and Vince's back. "Vince!" I protested. The attack was over in a moment. Lynn's arms fell limp by his sides and his head lolled back. His eyes closed and his breathing evened. Vince raised his head and showed off 2 deep puncture wounds on Lynn's neck. "What did you do that for?" I questioned him as he set Lynn on the floor.
"For our protection and his own," Vince replied as he stood over the limp man.
Lynn still breathed, but in a shallow sort of way. He knew the location of Bat, and if Ruthven is following our trail, then such information would have been tortured from him. Now he won't awaken for some days, and that will bide us some time. Also, I was hungry. My mouth dropped open as Vince strode past me.
"Don't you have a conscience?"
"You just drained an old man dry," I reminded him. Vince paused at the door and turned to me. "I will leave the conscience to you. Now we must find Bat." He left, and I threw my arms up in the air. "Great, I get the dirty job of being a psycho's conscience," I quipped as I followed him. Chapter 6. Vince stopped outside so I could catch up. "Where is Bat, anyway?" I asked him.
"The note said he would be where Tim was most fond of being," Vince told me.
I furrowed my brow.
"Where Tim was most
The barnyard where we buried him." Vince nodded.
"Yes, but we must return to our vehicle."
"I don't have enough energy to carry you over that distance." I put my hands on my hip and glared at him. "What are you implying, that I'm fat?" "No, that the old alchemist was a dry drink and didn't satiate my hunger," Vince explained. I cringed and stuck out my tongue. I didn't need to imagine that flavor in my mouth. It is far worse to have the taste in one's mouth, but we must hurry. The sun won't pause for us to waste time, Vince advised. We hurried through the streets and alleys as fast as our energies would allow, which wasn't as fast as I hoped. I, too, was depleted of energy. Also, our car sat half the city away. In half that distance I was exhausted. We were in the business district when I stumbled and fell against an alley wall. My stomach rumbled, and my body begged for sustenance. The streets to our right were alive with people throbbing with blood. I watched them walk by the mouth of the alley and licked my lips. Just a little bite, a little taste of their life, that's all I asked. I stumbled towards the bright lights and vibrant life. Just a drop, a smidgen of life fluid, I told myself. Nothing that would kill anybody. A hand grabbed my shoulder and spun me around. My back was slammed against the brick wall to my right, and I winced at the pain of the tiny rough bits of brick. Vince was my assailant, and he clamped his strong hands on my shoulders and pinned me to the wall.
What the hell is wrong with you?
I growled at him. If you drink blood you will lose more of your humanity, he told me. My mouth twisted with disbelief. But you had me drinking that damn stuff before.
That was before most of your life was extinguished.
Now you must control the hunger, he insisted. I cringed. The hunger gnawed at me like a starving wolf. Just a few yards away walked my satiation. Only a bite, that's it.
Not even a little bite?
I whimpered. Vince leaned down and his glasses slid down his nose. His red eyes looked into mine and I was pinned by his gaze.
Liz, be my conscience.
Don't let yourself walk the same road as I. Not yet. Not until we see if the only roads you can travel are death or undeath. I tried to look away from his beautiful dark eyes, but he grasped my chin between his fingers and kept my eyes turned to him. His voice was a soft whisper like a quiet spring day. Please. I closed my eyes and shuddered. The hunger raged inside me, but Vince's voice cut through like a hot knife through butter, a comparison that didn't help all that much. I ground my teeth together and nodded. All right, but we'd better get this over quick, or your cricket is going to become a carnivore, I warned him. I opened my eyes and saw Vince was smiling. Then let us hurry, and take the less traveled paths. I yelped when Vince swept me into his arms. He bent his knees and pushed straight up from the ground. I clutched his neck as we left the ground far beneath us. Did I ever mention I don't like heights? I yelled at him. No, but I will make a note of that for later, he replied.
How about now?
My last word came out as we landed atop the roof of the 4-story building by which we just stood. I looked around the rooftop, and saw the city spread out in front of us. Vince trotted towards the edge of the roof. Across the alley lay another building top. My eyes widened when Vince quickened his speed.
Vince, don't do it.
Afraid of heights, remember? Vince. Vince. I nearly strangled him, but instead I let out a long piercing scream as Vince pushed off from the raised border around the roof. We sailed across a dozen feet of empty space, and hit the opposite roof running. I shut my eyes and hugged myself to his cold but soothing chest. The wind whipped past us and blew my hair into my face. Did I ever mention you're really annoying? I shouted at the vampire.
Perhaps a time or two, he admitted. Well, here's another time.
You really are. I'd risked opening my eyes at the worst possible moment, when Vince took another running leap to the adjoining roof. We landed safely on the other side, and were making good progress across the city.
Are you trying to get us killed?
I shouted at him. No, I am trying to get us across the city with as little difficulty and in as little time as possible, he returned as we swept across the rooftops.
If you don't get us down, I'm going to kill you.
I growled.
Very well.
Vince jumped over the side of a rooftop, and I saw there was a wide street beneath us, too wide to jump across. Traffic zoomed by in both directions, and a few pedestrians walked the streets. I clutched onto Vince and buried my face in his coat as we dropped like 2 stones to the ground. Vince landed on both feet and bent his knees to lessen the impact. He pushed off from the ground and across the street, zigging and zagging between speeding cars. I winced, cringed, prayed, whimpered and begged for Vince to be beamed by a passing side mirror, but he was too agile. We reached the safety of the other side of the street and paused. I clutched my heart and glared at him.
All right, that's enough.
Put me, do WWWN. Vince jumped in the air and landed on top of the roof, and we restarted his terrifying fun run. I glared up at him and narrowed my eyes. Don't you ever get tired of being an ass? I snapped at him. No. Ugh. I muttered, and settled myself in for a long and death-defying ride. Somehow we survived his madness, and in a few minutes Vince dropped us off a roof for the last time. Our car sat by the manhole that led to the underground, and Vince set me down. My legs wobbled beneath my feet, but the trip had killed some of my appetite. Now I just wanted to throw up. Remind me never to fly Air Vince again, I told him. We must hurry. The night is growing late and you need to stay right where you are, a voice spoke up. Officer Romero emerged from the shadows behind our car. In one of his hands was a leash, and at the end of the leash was Brutus, his zombie dog. Brutus curled his lips back and snarled at Vince. Romero snapped his fingers and 24 officers emerged from the alleys, trash cans and even from mailboxes, or at least parts of them emerged from mailboxes. Other parts emerged from overturned cardboard boxes and anything else laying around. Vince pushed me behind him and frowned. You don't understand what you're doing, he warned the officer. I don't, but you're going to help me do that down at headquarters, Romero insisted. Vince froze and his head snapped up.
Duck, he yelled and pushed me to the ground.
I felt a wind pass over us, and looked up in time to see shadows flit over us. Doppelganger shadows. The creatures sailed through the air like dark kites, and sliced their bodies through the bodies of the zombies. The officers fell to pieces under the pressure, and their limbs, heads and torsos stacked high on the ground. The doppelgangers slipped into the shadows of the night, only to re-emerge like boomerangs of destruction to repeat their attack. Romero and a few others who listened to Vince were unscathed, and Romero loosed Brutus from his leash. The zombie dog leapt forward and caught its strong jaws around one of the flying shadows. The doppelganger cried out in fury as it was dragged to the ground. Brutus shook his head and whipped a shadow wildly about himself. The zombie officers fired their guns and hit a few of the creatures. The bullets flew through their targets and created small holes that quickly filled in again with shadow. Get the blood, Romero ordered his men. Vince grabbed my hand and dragged me towards the car. Behind and around us, the officers tried to regroup their bodies and themselves. We can't leave them, I protested. We are the reason for the attack, he pointed out. He opened the passenger door and flung us both inside with him on the bottom and me on his chest. Outside the car the battle continued, and blood was added to the destructive mix. The officers sprayed the lamb's blood through the air, and if the blood hit its target the skin of the doppelganger fizzled and smoked. The creatures of darkness screamed and flew faster through the air. Vince scooted from beneath me and into the driver's seat. He started up the car and punched the gas. We flew from the battle, and the battle flew with us. Chapter 7. The doppelgangers abandoned their attack on the parasquad, and launched themselves at our car. They attached their shadow claws to the roof and sides, and climbed their way forward to the front of the car.
Hold on,
Vince shouted at me, as he spun the steering wheel sharply to the left. His warning didn't give me enough time to obey, and I tumbled against my door. In the side mirror I saw the shadows hold on, and their shadowy bottoms flailed in the air behind them. They were like homicidal streamers around the car, as Vince took another sharp turn, this time to the right. I yelped and tumbled into his side. Are you trying to get them off, or me out? I shouted at him.
The glove compartment, he yelled back. I don't think that's going anywhere,
I growled. Vince spun the wheel so I toppled back onto my side of the car. He pointed a finger at the glove compartment, on my side of the vehicle. In there, he shouted. I dove for the box and opened it. Inside were half a dozen spray bottles filled with blood.
"Oh right, I knew that," I quipped as I pulled out one of the weapons.
A doppelganger slammed its face against my window and opened its wide mouth. The mouth was filled with razor-sharp teeth, and it made a horrible screech like nails on chalkboards. I rolled down my window and stuck the nozzle in its mouth.
"Bottoms up,"
I yelled as I sprayed a healthy dose of the blood into its gullet. The creature screamed and clawed at its mouth, losing its grip in the process and falling from the vehicle. One down, a dozen more to go. I stuck my head out the window and looked backwards. The others clawed their way forward, undeterred by Vince's homicidal driving. I stuck my head back in and looked to my partner. "Don't make any sharp turns," I ordered him. He raised an eyebrow. "What are you?" I didn't let him finish as I climbed out the window and onto the running board beneath my door. I clung to the side with one hand, while the other held the full spray bottle. The wind whipped at my hair and clothes, and the car bumped along the road and rattled my body and my grip. The doppelgangers saw me and climbed their way towards me. I sprayed the first unwary few and they dropped like their first companion, but the others hissed and backed off. I shuffled along the running board and pointed the spray at the crowd. Something grabbed my ankle and pulled. I yelped and hugged the rear door handle and risked a look down. A doppelganger lay beneath the car, and his hand was wrapped around my ankle. I leaned down and sprayed his hand, and doused myself in the process. A terrible burning erupted on my skin. It was as though tiny animals chewed and pulled at my flesh, tearing it from my body. I let out a horrible scream that mimicked the doppelganger, as it fell from the car and was ran over by the rear tire. The bottle slipped from my hand, and also fell beneath the wheel. The doppelgangers saw my weakness and dove at me with their claws splayed. I held my ring above me, and one of the creatures stuck their nose over the trinket. The ring glowed a brilliant blue light, as I focused on creating a small barrier. The unfortunate doppelganger screamed and burst into 1,000 tiny shadow fragments that were swept away by the wind around the fast-moving car. The barrier of light covered the top of me and kept away the beasts. I ground my teeth together and focused all my thoughts and strength on creating the icicles like Vince and I had done with Astaroth. The crystal-clear daggers pushed forth from the top of the barrier, and the doppelgangers scattered backwards. I launched the icicles, and like homing devices they flew from the barrier and stuck themselves into the chests of the creatures where there should have been a heart. The doppelgangers screamed and battered at the blue daggers. The crystals spread over their bodies and encased them in the transparent blue glass. Our foes lost their grip and fell from the vehicle to shatter on the road behind us. I dropped my arm and clung to the side of the vehicle. My whole body shook from the effort of using the ring and from the pain in my ankle. I didn't have the strength to pull myself inside. Vince coasted the car to a stop and flew out my door. He wrapped his arms around my waist and pulled me from the vehicle. I fell into him and cried out when I leaned too much weight on my ankle. Vince swept me into his arms and carried me to a nearby alley. He set my rear down on a box and knelt in front of me to inspect my wound. His long fingers pulled my pants up and my sock down. Even his careful touch made me wince.
"How bad is it?"
I hissed. He pursed his lips and shook his head.
"Not good."
I chanced a glance and winced. My skin bubbled like that of the doppelgangers, and there were inch-deep holes where I could see a hint of bone. "Ouchie!" I whimpered. Vince stood and looked around. His eyes fell on darkness behind a nearby dumpster. He dove forward and his hand whipped into the darkness. I heard a squeak and a small crack, and he pulled forth the body of a rat. Vince returned to me and held out the creature to me. "Drink this." I leaned away and stuck out my tongue. No, but thanks." "Drink it or the lamb's blood will spread," he warned me. I winced, and reluctantly took the filthy rat from Vince. Its fur was matted, and it hung limp in my hand. I closed my eyes and chomped down on its little body with fangs that stretched from my mouth. The warm blood flowed smoothly into my mouth, invigorating me with its life energy. A blanket of warmth filled me with a heat I didn't realize my body no longer possessed. I grasped the rat in both hands and gobbled up every drop of blood from its little life. When I knew it was dry, I pulled the rat away and looked down at its thin form. Dead and drained. Past the rat I could see and feel as my skin knitted itself back together. The bubbles disappeared, and the holes filled themselves in. Vince took the rat from me and tossed it into the darkness. He offered his hand to me. We must hurry. Bat may move on if he feels there is a danger to himself, he warned me. I raised my shaking hand and grasped his. He pulled me to his feet and against himself. I meant to push away from him, but my fingers grasped the front of his coat, and I buried my face in the fabric to stifle a sob. I was a monster, a creature of blood. If I needed proof, it was with the lamb's blood. Why? Why is this happening to me? I sobbed. Vince wrapped his arms around me and pressed me close to him.
The night isn't over yet, he reminded me.
No, not this one, or the next one, or 1,000 other nights and no day, I counted. His slender fingers reached up and stroked my hair. I will not allow you to become as I am. We will find Bat and learn how to rid yourself of the ring. I sniffled and looked into his face.
But what about you?
What happens if I get rid of my ring? He shrugged. We will see. Perhaps nothing, perhaps I will be destroyed, but we will never know unless we find Bat and the night is waning. I pushed away from him and wiped the tears from my cheeks.
Yeah, I guess we'd better get going.
Vince led me to the car, and sans doppelgangers we resumed our journey. The roads on which Vince took us led us through the city, and out into the country. In a few minutes I beheld the sight of a large old barn. In the middle of the barnyard was the blackened remains of a hot fire. Tim's burial spot. Vince parked the car beside the charred pit and we stepped out. About time, a voice wheezed, and Bat made his appearance at the barn door. In one hand was a thick stick used as a cane. He smiled at us, but his body shook. Vince and I rushed over to him. Are you hurt? I asked him. He waved away our helpful hands.
It's nothing you can fix, either of you.
Bat turned and gestured for us to follow him into the barn. He led us to a stack of bales on one side of the decrepit structure. I noticed Bat shuffled more than walked and his hands trembled. He lowered himself to a bale with a stacked pair for backing, and a coughing fit overcame him. Vince hurried to steady him, but Bat held up a hand while he coughed into the other one. I'm not so far gone that I need someone to hold me like I'm an infant, he protested. Too far gone? I repeated. Bat rallied himself and nodded. Yes. You see, I'm dying. Vince started and Bat chuckled. You thought it could never happen, what with my blood? Well, it can. It seems nothing lasts forever, even immortality. He chuckled, but the sound ended in another fit of coughing. Bat leaned back against the pile behind his seat and sighed. I've been dying for a while, but Tim's own death hastened my calling. Come on, you've got a few more centuries, I insisted. Bat smiled but shook his head. No. A few hours, maybe a day. My heart, he tapped his chest, my heart is giving out. Much as my crusty exterior hates to admit it, but my heart aches for Tim. He closed his eyes and I saw a few loose tears squeeze from beneath the lids. A man should never outlive his son. My mouth dropped open. Tim was. Bat held up his hand and opened his eyes.
No, not in the blood way, he assured me.
He was a young man when I first met him in London. He had the plague, but such life was in him. I couldn't let him die, not in the flower of his youth, so I gave him the ring. He chuckled and turned to Vince. I remember how angry you were with me for giving my ring to a stranger, but I know I made the right choice, and you thought so too after a time. Vince hung his head and said nothing. But we still need you, now more than ever. I protested. I looked to Vince. Vince, the letter from Tim. Vince straightened and pulled the letter. He handed it to Bat, who held the slip of paper between his shaking hands. Bat's lips moved in a silent reading, but he shook his head and handed the paper back to Vince.
I'm afraid I don't know what it means.
Tim was always smarter than I at these damned puzzles of his.
So we're stuck with nowhere to go, I mused.
Bat chuckled. Tim wouldn't make a riddle his friends couldn't solve. You'll figure out. Another coughing fit overcame him. The fit rattled his thin frame, and my eyes widened when I beheld a dribble of blood flow from the corner of his mouth. Vince knelt in front of Bat and grabbed his arm. Bat smiled at the vampire. Old friend, I'm sorry to leave you. This sounds stupidly selfish, but I think I'm ready to go. Vince shook his head, and his glasses slipped enough that I could see a few loose tears of blood in the lip of his eyes.
No, old nemesis, it doesn't.
Every human wishes for death at some point. It is merely your time. Bat smiled and turned his gaze to me.
Well, at least I'm leaving you with a competent babysitter.
Tim was the best at getting you to obey without you complaining much, but I think this young lady here is the best at convincing you to do it because it needs to be done. I snorted. Everyone keeps telling me that, but Vince keeps proving them wrong. Bat turned her head to Vince. Vincent, will you leave us for a moment? I wish to speak with Liz alone. Me? Don't you want to talk to Vince alone? I asked him. Bat shook his head. No, only you. Vincent, please leave. Vince raised an eyebrow but gave a nod and stood. I gave him a quizzical look he ignored as he walked to the barn doors, and shut them behind him. We were alone. Chapter 8. Liz, Bat spoke up, and I returned my attention to him.
There is something I must tell you about the ring.
About how to remove it from your finger. My eyes widened.
So there is a way to get it off besides dying?
I asked him. He nodded. Yes. A selfless act while he winced and clutched his chest. Maybe you can say this later? I suggested, but he shook his head.
Not much time.
I must tell you that a selfless act will allow the wearer to remove the ring. A selfless act? What kind of selfless act? I persisted. One in which death is nearly certain, for love can nullify the strongest magic. I forsook a longer life to save Tim, and he sought to protect you from Ruthven's wrath when he set the ring in the box beneath his bed, he explained.
But what happens if I don't have anyone to give it to?
Won't that mean Vince is free and will try to kill me? I pointed out. Bat smiled and his eyes studied my face. Do you believe he will? I shrugged.
I don't know what goes through that head of his.
Sometimes I think he wants to eat me, and other times, I paused and shook my head. And other times? Bat wondered. And other times, well, other times I think he's one bat short of a belfry, I quipped. Bat chuckled and set his hand over mine. Whatever you decide, trust that Vincent will do what his soul commands him. I snorted.
I don't think he can hear it all the way from the apartment.
You would be surprised how closely attached to it he now is, Bat mused. He covered his mouth to stifle another horrible, body-racking cough. I felt the time was growing short when I could ask him about Vince and me. Bat. What will happen to the rings when you die, he guessed, and he swayed his head from side to side.
I don't know.
My blood inside your ring may last until it dries to dust, or you may both be freed from the magic, or you might be connected to each other forever. I cringed.
And nothing but this selfless act would get it off me?
I guessed. Bat opened his mouth to speak, but he was shaken by another fit of coughing. More blood dribbled from his mouth, and his body shuddered. The fit passed, and he managed to smile at me.
It seems I was overly optimistic about a few hours, he mused.
Please call Vincent back in here. I reluctantly moved from his side, and hurried over to the door. I peeked outside and found Vince standing 20 yards off. Vince. You need to come back in here, I told him. Vince heard the urgency in my voice and swept past me into the barn. I turned to find him by Bat's side. The old man turned his head to Vince and set his hand on Vince's.
Bury me with Tim, will you?
One last favor to an old friend. Vince gave a nod and Bat chuckled as I came up to them.
Good, and don't cause too much trouble when I'm gone.
I don't want. Another fit overtook him and Bat's breathing grew more shallow. He closed his eyes, but the smile remained on his lips. I don't want to have to interrupt my heavenly vacation to come down here and haunt you. Bat's head lolled to one side. His chest ceased to move. I knelt down and grabbed his hand. Nothing moved inside the veins. The heat of life was leaving him. Bat. Bat. I whispered. No response. He was gone. Vince bowed his head, and I couldn't stop a sob from escaping my throat. My partner slipped his arms beneath Bat's limp body and lifted him. He turned away and walked to the entrance, where he turned his head towards me. We must burn him, as he requested. I nodded and stood. One final request for our fallen friend. An hour later, Vince and I stood together in front of a roaring fire of dried, rotten wood. Atop the pile was Bat's wrapped body, covered in an old tarp we found laying in the barn. I looked to my partner for any signs of grief. He stood stiffly by my side, and his cheeks glistened with moisture that wasn't from the air. Are you all right? I whispered.
Yes, came the blunt reply.
Do you?
No. All right, but if you need to talk, I persisted.
He said nothing, and I raised my ring finger and studied the glistened trinket. Think anything happened? I whispered to my partner.
No, Vince replied.
I sighed and dropped my hand to my side. So what now? He pulled out Tim's note and studied the contents. We must finish what Tim started, and hope it will lead to Ruthven's destruction.
And if we can't?
I wondered. That isn't an option, he returned. I nodded at the paper. If we can't figure that thing out, then it's the only option we have. I stepped close to Vince and leaned forward to read the message. Where it began, so shall it end. I pressed my lips together and frowned. Damn Tim and his wittiness. He was always an ass, even the first time. My eyes widened and I whipped my head up to Vince. I've got it. I paused and furrowed my brow.
At least I think I do.
He raised an eyebrow.
What is it?
Where it began could mean where he met one of us or Bat. Where'd he meet you guys? I questioned him. Venice. I cringed.
Well, since I don't think Tim had time to hop on a plane and do something over there, let's assume it's where he met me.
That'd be the park downtown. Vince snatched my hand and pulled me towards the car. We must hurry before the day comes. I looked behind us at the roaring fire.
What about Bat?
I reminded him. He will not be bothered by our leaving. You're such a romantic, I quipped as he dragged me into the car. Vince pressed his foot to the gas pedal, and never let it leave the floor, as we careened down the country roads and back into the dark city. The clock was ticking. The sun would rise in a few hours, and we'd have to go underground, or at least take a long nap. Vince drove through the less busy side streets, and we ended up on the far side of the park near one of the parking lots. He finally pressed the brake, and we skidded into one of the many empty spots in the lot. I opened the door and stumbled out. I wish you wouldn't be trying to do Ruthven's work by killing us, I scolded him.
Where exactly did you meet Tim?
Vince questioned me. I nodded at the far side of the park. The place was a menagerie of bike and walking trails that wound around a large pond, made in the likeness of the number 8. The center was thinner than the two ends, and over the center was a stone bridge. Trees grew around the water, and spotted the green grass that bordered the walking paths. Hills rolled through the park, and assisted the various hedges of bushes, in obscuring a clear view of the entire area in any one spot. Over here, I told him. I led Vince along the deserted walking path, and over the hills to the stone bridge over the clear, serene water. We crossed the bridge, and I paused to glance at the water beneath us. The still surface reflected my face, and I saw it was ghastly pale. I reached up and touched my sallow cheek. Vince came up beside me, and set a hand on my shoulder.
We don't have time for this, he insisted.
I shook myself, and nodded at the bushes that sat at the end of the opposite side of the bridge.
I found him in those bushes.
Vince strode over the brush and waded into the mess. He knelt down and disappeared beneath the scrawny branches.
There is something here. What is it?
I asked as I hurried forward. I reached the brush as Vince stood. In his hands was a dirt-covered metal box. There was a lock on the front, in the form of a man's wizened old face with an open mouth. My eyes widened at the familiarity of the lock and box.
That's just like the box Tim hid under his bed, and isn't that the same lock like you have on the money box?
I pointed out. Vince freed himself from the brush, and led me over to a nearby stone bench. He set the box on the bench, and inserted his finger into the mouth of the lock. The mouth bit down hard enough to draw blood, and the mechanism sprang open. Vince lifted the lid and revealed a book. My mouth dropped open. It was a book with a bumpy plain brownish cover with faded gold inlay. There wasn't any writing anywhere I could see.
That's it?
That's why Tim was killed? I asked Vince. Vince pulled the book out and flipped through the pages. I could see a gibberish language on the sheets, and a few pictures. The farther he flipped, the deeper Vince frowned. This book is the master spell book, the one on which the others have been based. So we found the template for those others?
What's so important about that?
I wondered.
There are a great deal of spells in here that aren't contained in the mass-produced books.
They are powerful spells even Vera would have difficulty casting, and Bat would have had trouble concocting, Vince explained to me. He paused at the last page, and his mouth was slightly ajar.
What is it?
I asked him. I slid beside him and glanced at the page. It was handwritten like the other pages, but the ink was fresh and vibrant. There was an illustration of a ring or rings, and notes in English that included the ring specifications and ratio of human blood to vampire blood. Our rings? How'd he find out this stuff?
Through trial and error, a voice spoke up.
We whipped our heads up and saw Ron Field standing 10 yards from us. His usual thin smile was on his tight lips, and he bowed to us. But Lord Ruthven would be better at explaining the intricacies than I. If you would come with us, he awaits your presence at his home. He paused and held out his hand.
But first the book, if you will.
Vince shoved the book into my hands, and the ring on his finger glowed. We have dealt with you before, Vince warned Field. Field bowed his head. You have, but not with those I have brought. He snapped his fingers, and from the darkness emerged doppelgangers and werewolves. The dogs snarled at us, and the doppelgangers gnashed their long sharp teeth. You may be able to destroy the doppelgangers with your light, but the werewolves will certainly destroy you while you're distracted, so what will it be? Will you come? Vince snarled but straightened and his stance relaxed. Field's smile broadened. A good choice. Field snapped his fingers again, and a pair of werewolves came up behind us. One grabbed Vince's hands and clamped silver manacles with steel inner lining over his wrists. The other werewolf tried to snatch the book away from me, but the moment his clawed hand touched the cover, a burning light shot from the fabric. The light soaked into his body and raced up the veins in his arms. He had enough time to howl in pain before his body was engulfed in the light, and he exploded into a million falling pieces of glitter. Holy shit! I yelped as I stumbled back from the exploded werewolf. Field's mood darkened. Give the book over to me, he demanded. Vince stiffened. Do not give the book to anyone, my partner ordered me.
What?
Why?
What the hell's wrong with this thing?
I asked him. The book cannot be taken from you, Vince explained. How the hell is that going to help me if they kill me? I argued. One of the werewolves snuck behind me, and I swung around and pressed the book against him. The light engulfed him like his companion, and in a few seconds there was another shower of glitter.
Oh, that's how it's going to help, I quipped.
So long as you hold it you will not be harmed, but you can't say the same for your partner, Field spoke up. He held up one of his hands with his fingers splayed outward, and his palm facing towards me. His fingers glowed with magic, and I saw a glow beside me. The bands around Vince's wrists glowed with a similar light. The top half of the inch-thick silver melted and morphed into thin tendrils. The tendrils rose up like attacking snakes and snapped their bodies against Vince. He cried out and stumbled forward as their points of attack sizzled from the contact of vampire skin against silver. Vince. I yelled. I spun around and held the book towards Field. Let him go, or everyone gets a taste of the book. Field closed his fingers towards his palm and the tendrils latched onto Vince's arms. They sank through his clothes and smell of burning flesh permeated the air. Smoke rose from Vince's body, and he stumbled forward and fell on one knee.
There are several ways to kill you both at the same time.
My fingers might slip and your partner will die, Field threatened me. I clenched my teeth and glared at him. Fine. We'll go with you. I held out the book. Field's eyes flitted to one of the doppelgangers. The shadow creature flew over to me and snatched the book from my hand. Field lowered his hand, and it ceased to glow, releasing Vince from the bindings of the silver tendrils. A werewolf clamped silver manacles on my wrists and pushed me forward. Another pulled Vince to his feet and shoved him beside me.
That was not wise, he hoarsely whispered to me.
You got a better plan? I hissed. There will be enough talk when you speak with Lord Ruthven, Field told us. The henchman led our large group of supernaturals through the park to the parking lot, where sat our car. A doppelganger slithered out from beneath the car and grinned at us. That explained how they followed us. I spat on the creature, and it recoiled and hissed at me. Besides our car there was a large steel-looking van and several small black cars. The rear doors of the van opened and the werewolves piled inside. Field led us to one of the sleek black cars and opened the door. He turned to us with that sick smile on his face. Step faster. The Lord awaits us. Chapter 9. We slipped into the car, and found it had a back with opposing seats that stretched across the entire width of the vehicle. There was a dividing wall between the rear and the front, and a closed window that could slide down. We took the rear seats, and Field slid in after us and took the seat opposite where we sat. The car pulled out of the parking lot, and bumped along the roads towards our unknown destination. The windows were too darkly tinted to see out them. I could tell we moved at a fast clip, because of all the bumps we rode over. Field held the book in his lap, and his hand brushed against the cover.
Quite an exquisite piece of work.
Real human flesh for the cover, though you can't tell, he mused. I cringed and leaned toward my partner. Remind me to wash my hands when we get out of this, I whispered to Vince. Field chuckled, and I whipped my head to our captor. What are you laughing at, Chuckles? We're going to kick your guys' asses when we get to your boss place. False bravado will accomplish nothing, he countered. Who said anything about false? If I'm going to die, I might as well take you guys with me, I quipped. I leaned forward towards Field and studied him. I was wondering, do you wear the same suit every day? I mean, that's the only outfit I've ever seen you in. How did you get the sewer stains off after the last time I kicked your ass? The smile slipped from Field's lips. If you... Blah blah blah.
That's all you bad guys do is talk this, threaten that.
Get over yourselves. We're not afraid of you, are we, Vince? I turned to my partner and winked at him. Come on, you know you're not afraid of a little itty-bitty wizard man here.
Sorcerer, Field corrected me. Suck up, more like it.
How do you manage to talk when your lips are permanently sealed to Ruthven's ass? I asked him. Field's hands tightly gripped the cover, and if it hadn't been magical I imagined he would have torn the tome in two. You are irritating me. Shut up, he demanded. I snorted. Aha. Vince, care to tell him how likely it is I'm going to shut up? I requested of my partner.
Not likely, he assured Field.
Field raised his hand and his fingers glowed with that dark wizard light of his. I felt my lips pressed together against my bidding, and Field's sly smile slipped onto his pale lips.
That will do until we reach Lord Ruthven's home.
I tried to open my mouth but my lips wouldn't budge. He'd glued them shut with magic. I scowled at our captor, but he only continued to smile. Oh hell no. If I was going to get driven to an evil guy's home, with his main henchman staring at us the whole way, I wasn't going to go quietly. I lifted my feet, and slammed my heels on the controls that covered the door to my left. They were locked, but the force of the blow meant my feet sank deep into the controls. Sparks flew from the panel, and the window inched down a few inches.
"Stop that!"
Field ordered me. Field stood, but so did Vince. Vince pushed off our seat and rammed his shoulder into Field's chest. The lackey was shoved into the back of his seat, and pinned there by Vince's body. The book clattered to the floor, and I felt my lips freed of their incantation. "Dibs!" I yelled as I dove for the book. Field managed to get a hand between himself and Vince, and a pulsing light erupted from his palm. Vince flew back and collided with me as I lunged for the book. The pair of us toppled into our seat, in a mess of flailing limbs and complaints. "You need less pointy shoes," I scolded my partner, as he jabbed me in the gut with his footwear.
"That is quite enough,"
Field commanded. He snatched the book from the floor and stood over us. If he'd been a demon, fire would have shot out of his ears and nostrils. Instead, he was a sorcerer, and the mad sorcerer's hands blazed with his dark power. He pointed his free palm at us, and his eyes blazed with fury. "You!" "They will not be harmed," a voice spoke up. Field winced and dropped his hand to his side. I looked around the small space, and my eyes fell on the window to my left. There was a dark void instead of the reflection of the interior, and inside the void was the image of Ruthven. He smiled at us and bowed his head. "A pleasure to see you again, and we will meet soon." Field, restrain them and no more. Ruthven's face disappeared. Field pursed his lips but raised his free hand and waved it in the air. I felt myself float off the floor, and land comfortably on the seat. Vince's body did the same. Tight ropes of magic appeared out of thin air, and wrapped themselves around our torsos, pinning our manacles arms to our sides. The bands also wound around our mouths, cutting me off from my fun. Field smiled, seated himself on his seat, and sat quietly with the book safely in his lap. The rest of the car ride was uneventful, and took only a few minutes. The car coasted to a stop, and the door to my left opened to reveal a zombie manservant complete with monkey suit. He stepped back and Field exited. Field's hand trailed behind him, and I felt the bonds around me lift me from my seat. I was turned upside down, and the same was done to Vince. We floated through the open door, and caught our first glimpse of Lair Ruthven. His home was a large Victorian mansion, on one of the taller crests of hills that surrounded the city. Its tall peaked gables cut through the sky, and rather than wood, the siding was made of sturdy rocks scavenged from the local area. Paned glass windows glared down at us as we walked the cement path to the double doors hewn from oak. The home was surrounded on all sides by large ancient oak trees, and a green lush yard lay at their roots. Bushes leaned against the side of the house beneath the lowest of the paned glass windows. The entire perimeter was surrounded by a 10-foot-tall fence, made from the same rocks as the house. In the shadows of the bushes and trees, dozens of werewolves and doppelgangers lay in wait for intruders to snack on. Vince and I floated up the path and through the front doors. The inside was lavishly decorated in early medieval torture chamber. Weapons hung from the walls, everything from axes to ninja stars, and suits of armor and Iron Maidens lined the walls between lavish wooden Renaissance-era tables. I thought perhaps he was compensating for something. Field guided us across the carpeted wood floor, and to the rear left part of the house. A door opened on our left, and we entered a double-floor study. The room reached into the second floor, and the balcony up there was lined with bookcases. The lower floor was much the same, except the bookcases were interrupted by a large stone fireplace and the entrance. A desk sat at the back of the room, and behind the desk was a window that stretched nearly to the ceiling. Seated at the desk was our host and prime captor, Lord Ruthven. He smiled and stood as we entered, but a look at our floating and his eyes flickered to Field. "Release them. They are our guests," he snapped at his servant. Field bowed his head, and with his fingers he righted us and released us from his hold. The lackey moved over to his master, and handed him the book. Ruthven's smile returned, as he swept a hand over the cover. "What an interesting adventure this has been, and such a nuisance. Tim had a great deal of courage and stupidity to steal this tome from me." "I'd say the first one," I spoke up. Ruthven looked up from his book and at me. "You in particular have surprised me, Miss Stokes. I would never have fathomed a novice such as yourself would be such a nuisance, but you managed my manservant quite well." Field, who stood off to one side, frowned but said nothing.
I shrugged. "I have a gift for being a nuisance.
Just ask Vince." Ruthven chuckled. "Vince? Have you become as cozy as that so quickly?" "It's either that or do a murder-suicide," I quipped. Ruthven opened the book to the final page. "As amusing as this conversation is, I'm afraid we must get down to business. You see, I've been working on my own set of rings like those you wear. It's taken me quite a few centuries to figure out how Bartholomew achieved the success that he did, and I'm afraid I've utterly failed to duplicate the process. My blood is not as energized with magic as was Bartholomew's." "Have you tried draining it all?" I asked him. He slammed the book shut, tossed the tome onto the desk and turned his attention to us. "No, but on the subject I'd been meaning to have a personal interview with the gentleman, but my doppelganger who followed you tells me he's dead. Is this true?" "'Fraid so," I told him. "You wouldn't be lying to me, would you?" He mused. "We're the good guys, remember? We don't lie," I reminded him. He chuckled. "I see. Well, no matter. I have a pair of rings here, which I can use to achieve the power and longevity I seek. The only problem remains on how to convince you to grant me custody of Vince." I glared at him. "You're babbling. What the hell do you want from us, and can we get it over with?" I questioned him. Ruthven smiled and bowed his head to me. "You're quite right. I'll be frank. What I'm proposing is that you pass your ring to me, and grant me full custody over Vincent. I'm sure it can't be comfortable for you to be chained to someone of such a temperament. He is rather old and, from what Field tells me, rather unfriendly. Then I will have the power I seek, and you can go on with your life." He held his palm out to me. "What do you say? Will you reclaim your life?" Chapter 10. I had to admit the idea was tempting, but there was one problem.
"Nice try, but I can't get it off," I told him.
Ruthven raised an eyebrow. "Is that so? Well, I'm sorry I asked for your permission. It seems we'll have to remove it the old-fashioned way. This will be messy, but won't kill you to ensure Vincent survives." He snapped his fingers and Field stepped forward. The sorcerer waved his hand, and from the hall flew one of the axes that graced the walls along with a chopping block. Ruthven stepped back, and the block was set down between him and us. My manacles were loosed and fell to the floor with a clank, but Field's power wrapped around my left wrist and yanked me forward. My hand was slapped palm down onto the block, and my fingers were splayed out. The axe hovered over me, and my eyes widened as it tilted back for a downward swing.
"This will not work," Vince spoke up.
Ruthven held his hand towards Field's, and the sorcerer stopped the preceding pinching of my finger and ring. Our host turned to Vince with a raised eyebrow.
"What won't work?"
"You may be able to remove her finger, but the ring won't be in your power. It must be passed on by choice or the magic dies," Vince warned him. "And why should you warn me of this? You would be free if I cut her finger off. Unless," Ruthven's eyes fell on me and his lips twisted into a terrible grin. "Unless you have a deeper bond than I imagined. Is that it? Do you care for this pathetic human, Vincent the vampire?" Vince said nothing, but I noticed he was stiff. "I see. I will take that as a yes. Unfortunately, that means we are at an impasse. I need that ring and its powers, and she is unable to remove it." My eyes widened as a crazy, suicidal idea hit me. If I was right, then we'd be saved, and if I was wrong, then we'd be dead. Or if I was half right, we'd be all dead. Not great odds, but I really wanted to keep all my fingers. Maybe I can," I spoke up. Ruthven returned his attention to me. "Can what?" "Maybe I can pull the ring off. Maybe I was, lying. Bluffing, but you caught my bluff." I let out a not very convincing chuckle. I didn't want to get rid of this hold I have over Vince, but I kind of want to keep my fingers, so why don't you tell your magic man to let me go so I can take it off?" Ruthven raised an eyebrow. "You're a terrible liar. It seems I must take my chances with your finger. He snapped his fingers and Field raised the axe again. Wait. I'm not joking. I looked Ruthven straight in the eyes. I can take the ring off and hand it to you. I swear it. Ruthven frowned, but I breathed out when he waved his hand at Field's.
Very well, but do it quickly.
I was released from Field's control and stood. I felt Vince watch me from behind his sunglasses and I smiled at him. You'd better kick some ass if these guys kill me for this, I told him. Ruthven's eyes widened.
What are you?
I yanked on the ring. It slipped off my finger and I tossed it to Vince.
Crush it.
I yelled at him. Vince turned around, and the ring landed in a manacled hand. His fingers wrapped around the ring and crushed the golden diamond. Blood from the diamond poured from his fingers and onto the floor.
No.
Ruthven screamed. He snatched the floating axe from the air and swung it at me. You bitch. You'll pay for that. I ducked and dove beneath his desk. My position gave me a full view of the room, and my eyes fell on Vince. He had his back turned to me, and he stood as still as a statue. Ruthven turned his attention to his lackey. Destroy that vampire, he ordered Field. Field smiled and raised both his hands. They glowed with his dark magic, and above himself, he formed a giant energy ball. Still Vince did nothing. Vince, run. I yelled at my partner, but he didn't move. Field threw the ball at Vince, and it collided with the vampire's back. I expected the blast to make Vince into a donut, but the energy slammed into him and, well, dissipated. The front flattened on impact, but it flowed around my partner like he was an untouchable barrier, and faded into the air beyond Vince. The blast caught on the front of his glasses, however, and they clattered to the ground in front of his feet. The energy blast obscured Vince from view for a few seconds, and when I could see him again my mouth dropped open. His body was surrounded by a blue energy that pulsed with power. It flowed over him like a dark, rippling river, and covered him completely. Vince half turned to us and his eyes blazed with a bright red color. He curled his lips back in a grin that showed off his long, sharp fangs. Ruthven gasped and stumbled back. All his bravado was gone, and he whipped his head to Field. Destroy him, he ordered his minion. In a moment, Field prepared another energy blast, smaller than the first, and threw it at Vince. Vince quickly broke his manacles and raised his hand so the palm was turned towards the attack. The ball hit his palm, and his fingers wrapped around the ball. The energy was extinguished, and a small puff of dark smoke rose from between his fingers. Field's eyes grew as wide as saucers, and the sorcerer stumbled back. Vince moved too fast for any of us to see. One moment he stood near the door, and the next he was across the room and his teeth were deep in Field's throat. The sorcerer let out a garbled scream that told me he wasn't enjoying Vince's hickey. I noticed movement out of the corner of my eye, and turned to see Ruthven dive for the spot Vince had just occupied. He shoved his face into the carpet, and licked at the drops of blood among the crumpled remains of my ring. Ruthven licked it all up and raised his head. His face scrunched up in pain and he clutched at his stomach. My eyes widened when I beheld a dark energy arise from his body, and swirl around him. Vince! I yelled at my partner. Vince dropped the dead weight of Field's body and turned to Ruthven. Our adversary struggled to his feet, and held his hands out in front of him as he turned to us. The dark energy pulsed around his form, and a wide, wild grin slipped onto his face. His eyes were wide with insanity, and their color was now pure black, no pupils. Ruthven tilted his head back and laughed. Finally! Finally I have it, he cried out. Vince clenched his teeth and disappeared in a flash of speed. Ruthven whipped out his arm with his hand outstretched, and Vince came back into my view with his neck caught in the vice of Ruthven's fingers. You think you can stop me, vampire? This is the very power that sealed you to that ring. Ruthven lifted Vince off the ground, and threw him across the room. Vince's back slammed against the bookcases, and he fell face forward onto the floor. Dozens of books toppled onto him, and he shook his head as Ruthven strode toward him. Ruthven raised his hands and each formed a small ball of energy.
This is what it means to have power, true power, immortal power.
Vince struggled to his feet, and leaned one hand against the broken shelves behind him. A sly smile slipped onto his face and he shook his head.
Nothing is immortal.
The power you hold will slip from your fingers, and you will turn to dust like all others before you. Ruthven's eyes narrowed and his grin slipped from his lips. I will prove you wrong, vampire, by destroying you and finally taking this city for myself. The balls of energy flew from his hands and struck Vince in the chest. Blood flew from the impact points and splattered the floor and furniture. Vince's eyes widened, and he fell forward onto the carpet. He lay still, and a pool of blood grew beneath him. Vince! I screamed. Ruthven whipped his head around, and his black eyes fell on me. The crooked grin reappeared, and he strode toward me. What a terrible host I am. I'd completely forgotten about you, Miss Stokes. I will remedy that by letting you follow your partner into death. I scrambled backward and popped out at the rear of the desk, so that stood between me and Ruthven. The glowing alchemist walked up to the other side of the desk, and held a hand out towards me. A new energy ball appeared on his palm, and I backed up further until my back hit the towering window. Give my regards to Vincent and Bartholomew. My eyes noticed movement behind Ruthven.
I think you forgot something.
He frowned and raised an eyebrow.
What?
When a vampire dies, they turn to dust. Ruthven's eyes widened, and he turned in time to let the front of his face collide with Vince's fist. The alchemist flew across the room, and slammed into the untouched bookcases. The piles of books fell from the shelves, and covered him completely in their pages. I returned my attention to my partner. Vince clutched his chest over his heart, where blood poured from a large hole made by one of the energy balls. His sharp teeth ground together, and he stood unsteadily on his feet. I raced around the far side of the desk and grabbed his free arm.
We have to get out of here,
I ordered him. He shrugged me off and shook his head. No. He must be destroyed, he wheezed. Ruthven burst from the books, and the tomes flew in all directions. The books flew as fast as bullets and penetrated walls, chairs, and the floor like daggers. Vince whipped his hand out in front of us, and a dark blue barrier appeared before us and blocked the books from slicing into us. Ruthven's blazing eyes fell on us, and the energy around him flared up like someone threw gasoline on a fire. A lot of gasoline. We're talking about a truckload. Vampire! Ruthven screamed. Vince cut the air with his hand, and our barrier transformed into the familiar ice daggers. They flew forward at Ruthven, but the mad alchemist raised up the remaining books and the tomes took the hit. Ruthven parted his barrier and grinned. Feeling weak, vampire? A little thirsty? My eyes widened and I turned to Vince.
You have to bite me,
I commanded him. He shook his head. I would take too much, he refused.
It's either that, or he's going to take my life,
I snapped as I pointed a finger at Ruthven. Vince got the point, and I got the points of two fangs buried deep into my neck. Pain shot through my body as he drained me with a speed that mirrored his sprinting ability. The world spun around me and my legs buckled. My vision faded to gray, then black, and I knew only sound and touch. The moment my vision left me, I felt someone grab me and wrench me from Vince's arms. I was tossed aside like a rag doll, and I flew across the desk. My hazy vision returned in time for me to see me fly towards the window, and I raised my arms to cover my face. A shadow flitted past me and snatched me from the air. It was Vince, and he held me close against him. I looked up into his face and saw there was color in his skin, but his wounds were only partially healed. Blood still flowed from the hole in his chest, and I could see a hint of bone beneath his charred clothes and skin. Vince looked down at me and smiled. It seems I may be unable to take that retirement of which we spoke. My eyes widened, and I clung to him. Like hell you can't. You can beat him, I insisted. Vince leaned down and captured my lips in a passionate, blood-soaked kiss. My legs wobbled beneath me, and I forgot to breathe. He broke us apart and held me in the crux of one arm, while his other one smashed the glass window to his right. Farewell, partner, he whispered. Don't you? Vince lifted me in both hands and tossed me through the opening in the glass. I rolled and skidded 20 yards before I dug my shaky fingers into the lawn and looked back at the house. The yard was complete chaos as werewolves and doppelgangers raced away and towards the house. Through the window I glimpsed Vince jump across the desk and grapple with Ruthven, as dozens of werewolves and the shadow creatures swept into the room. Vince leapt back and stood atop the desk. He pointed his palms upward at the ceiling, and a blast of icicles burst from his hands. They sailed upward and crashed through the ceiling, destroying everything in their paths. Some of the daggers burst into small pieces when they hit the ceiling, and their tiny bodies rained down on Vince's oncoming attackers, skewering them. The whole house began to shake, and the ceiling buckled beneath the strain of the holes. I clenched my teeth and pushed through my exhaustion so I could raise myself onto my feet. My legs held, and I stumbled towards the house and the window. I reached the glass just as the ceiling gave way. Vince aimed both his palms toward Ruthven as the madman leapt at him. The icicles only slowed him down, and the pair collided as the ceiling fell to the floor. Shattered glass, splintered wood and broken rocks flew out from the window and knocked into me. One large rock hit me in the temple, and everything went black. Chapter 11. The next thing I remembered was light, and a pair of strong arms beneath my armpits. I was dragged out from beneath a heavy pile of debris, and I blinked against the harsh light of the midday sun. "Easy there," a familiar voice called to me. "Vince." I weakly whispered. "No, Officer Romero," the voice replied. I squinted through the bright lights, and saw it was indeed Romero who held me. He lifted me into his arms and carried me away from the house, and towards a row of cars and vans. I was too weak to break free from his strong zombie grasp, but that didn't stop me from squirming. "No. Vince. He's still in there," I protested. "If he is, we haven't found him yet," Romero told me. I looked over his shoulder and my eyes widened. Nothing remained of the house. All the walls had collapsed into the house and broken into millions of tiny rocks, atop the fallen second floor and roof. Most of the remains were charred as though from a fire, and some of the other members of the para squad were still putting out the flames. "What happened?" I asked him. We reached one of the cars, and Romero set me in the open door on the back seat. "We were hoping you could tell us that," he returned. One of his officers handed him a blanket, and he wrapped it around my shoulders and knelt in front of me. "We received reports of supernatural activity up here, and by the time we arrived the place was in flames. It took us hours just to put those out so we could get close enough to inspect the wreckage. We managed to capture a few werewolves hiding in the trees along the driveway, but they aren't talking." I pulled the blanket closer around myself, and nodded at the ruined house. This was Ruthven's house. Vince and I found a book Tim stole from him. It was the one all the others were copied from. Ruthven had Field take us here so he could get his book back and steal our rings, I told him. Romero raised an eyebrow. "And did he?" I shook my head. "No, but he did some sort of magic, and Vince and him fought. Vince threw me out of the house and everything crashed down on them." I paused and clutched my head in one hand. The memories weren't pretty. Romero leaned back and shook his head. "If the story had come from anybody but you, I wouldn't have believed he was capable of saving anybody else's hide but his own." I looked past him at the ruined wreck of a house. He might still be in there. "We have to," I tried to stand, but Romero grabbed my shoulders and pushed me back down. "You do nothing. If he's in there we'll find him, or what's left of him. Vampire ashes are a little different from the normal stuff, so there's a chance at finding them, but that's a bad mess in there. We might overlook it," he warned me. "Ashes? No." I turned away and shook my head. "He has to be alive." "He just has to be," I insisted. Romero caught my eyes with his own gaze. "Listen, there's not much chance of anybody being alive in there. I don't think you would have made it if you'd been any closer. You were lucky the walls fell inward or I would have dragged out your corpse." "I can help. I can help find Vince. He might come to my voice," I insisted. "You can help by staying right here. Even if he did come out, the sun would probably kill him. It's best you let the professionals manage this mess, Romero advised. I pursed my lips but nodded. What was the use of arguing? I was as weak as a lamb, and wouldn't be of much use other than falling into some hole. Romero smiled and stood. Good. Now you stay here, and we'll see if we can get you some food and water. The rest of the day was like a horrible nightmare. All I could think about was the last moments I'd seen Vince, and his lips against mine. The salvage work continued on the house, but it was slow going. There was a basement in the house, and more than one zombie officer fell into a deep hole. A half hour before sunset, I had enough energy to shuffle to the edge of the work. Romero noticed me, and pulled himself from the wreckage to stand by my side. We faced the house, or what remained of it. I'm going to call off the search in a few minutes, he warned me. My eyes widened, and I whipped my head up to stare at him. What? Why? We may be night creatures, but this is getting too dangerous. The human cops are breathing down our necks to see what's going on up here, and I don't know how much longer I can keep them away, he revealed. But you can't give up. The study isn't finished yet. I insisted. He put a hand on my shoulder and sighed. Yes, it is. I just finished the search myself. There's nothing there except some rocks and… Romero, one of his officers called to him. What is it? Romero yelled back. I found something. The other officer stood at mid-center in the study. Romero stepped gently through the debris and I followed. Other officers joined us, and the first one knelt and pointed at a piece of cloth that poked out from beneath a large sheet of roofing. Romero turned to his officers. Get it up. A group of them grabbed the edges of the roofing and heaved. The sheet lifted, and the men carried it away to reveal the rest of the cloth. It was a business suit attached to a charred body. There was a large hole in the chest the size of a fist, and a fleshy skull glared back at us. I gasped and turned away. Is this Ruthven? Romero asked me. I shut my eyes and nodded. Yeah, it's him. I think that's enough. Let's get this body out of here and pack up, he called to his men. My shoulders slumped and Romero came up to stand by my side. I'm really sorry about this, but he's gone. I squeezed my eyes shut to keep the tears from falling. Can I stay here? Just for tonight? I pleaded. I think I can give you that much time but no more, he told me. That's enough. The officers carted off Ruthven's body, and piled into their vehicles. Romero was the last to leave. He set a hand on my shoulder. You sure you don't want to come? It's almost dark. I'll be fine. I'm not afraid of the dark anymore, I assured him. All right. I'll need you to come down to the station later to make a full report, he requested. Sure. Tomorrow, I agreed. Romero turned away and went to his car. The parasquad turned on their lights and drove down the hill. In a few minutes, I was alone. The sun in the distance glimmered its last glow, as it set below the horizon. I stood among the wreckage of the house and my life, and cried my eyes out. My sobs pierced the air and my shoulders shook. I let myself fall to my knees onto the rubble, and I clutched my face in my hands. Why did you have to die? Why? I cried to the growing darkness around me. Then, in my darkest hour, a bright light intruded on my morning. I paused and lifted my head, as a flickering light in the sky caught my eye. The sun was too recently set for stars to be out, and this light came from below the hill, from the city below me. I stood and watched the blue light zip to and fro, but always on track towards the hill. The light reached the edge of the grass and flew over the blades, leaving in its wake a ripple of wind. The light looked so familiar as it reached me, and spun around me in a heightening flurry. It was like a lost shooting star looking for a friend, and found me atop this lonely hill. The light was a burning ball of blue, as it flitted in front of my face and zipped over to a pile of debris close at hand. It disappeared into the nearly invisible cracks, but I could still see a faint glow from its body. I crept over to the debris, and tried to lift the top. Some of it pulled away, enough to let me see there was a cavity into the basement. I leaned down and peeked inside. A pair of red eyes stared back at me. I shrieked and fell back on my butt and scrambled backward. The debris in front of me rose like a dome and the top pieces slid off the bottom, until the final sheet of stone and wood was tossed aside. Vince stood before me, a mess of tattered and bloody clothes and flesh. Never had he looked so good to me. Vince. I squealed as I dove for him and latched onto his shoulders. He still stood in his hole, so that I could only see his upper half. He wrapped his arms around me and chuckled.
It seems I was missed, he teased.
I pulled away from him and tried to slap his cheek, but he caught my hand. He didn't catch the other hand before it connected with his other cheek.
That's for scaring me half to death into believing you were dead.
I scolded him. Destroyed, he corrected me.
Not coming back ever, I rephrased.
I leaned back and looked him over. His chest was covered in blood, and his clothes were in tatters. Deep gashes covered his arms and his face, and his hair was partially singed.
Just to stay on topic, how did you make it through that wreck?
Luck and some assistance from Ruthven, he told me. I raised an eyebrow. Ruthven helped you? Vince chuckled.
Not willingly.
He shoved me downward into the basement, and I flung him out of my hole before the ceiling collapsed atop me. Vince paused and looked around.
Has he been found? Yeah, the parasquad found what was left of him.
He's not going to be bothering us anymore, I assured him. And are we alone? He wondered as he looked around. Yeah, everybody else left and I frowned and glanced down into his hole.
Where'd that little light go?
I asked him.
Light? He repeated.
Yeah, the little blue light. I saw it fly in there. That's how I knew you were down there, or that something was down there, I explained. Vince shook his head.
I saw nothing before I awoke.
However, he moved forward, but he froze and clutched at his chest. Vince, what's wrong? I asked him. I have solved your mystery, he told me. He held out his hand, and the same blue light as before erupted from his hand. The light was similar to when he used the powers of the ring and his own powers, but it gave off a warm, comforting glow. My eyes widened at the sight of the beautiful flickering flame.
What's that?
I whispered. Do you not recognize the soul from the vial? He returned.
Soul in your soul?
I yelped.
The same, he replied.
But how? Why? When? I asked him. It seems my soul thought it time to return to me, whether I wished for it or not. Perhaps he trailed off in thought.
Perhaps what?
I persisted. His eyes flickered up to mine. Perhaps it was what truly awakened me, and I was in true death or close to it. I smiled and grasped his warm hand between both of mine. Then I say you owe your soul an apology for neglecting it for so long, and it's about time you took it out of that vial and let it live with you. Vince reached up with his free hand and cupped my cheek. Only if you will live with me also, he insisted. I leaned into his touch.
I guess I can live with that, I teased.
Perhaps in Undeath, he suggested. I pulled away from his hand and snorted. Baby steps, Vince. First we have to get you some new clothes. Have you finally take a bath? And Vince leaned forward and pressed his lips against mine. He pulled me against him, and the feel of him pressed against me made me moan into our kiss. I broke away for some air. Or maybe we can skip the new clothes. And the bath, he wondered.
Not the bath.
You need one pretty bad. Vince chuckled and swept me into his arms. As you wish. I snuggled against his chest and smiled into his red eyes. You know I love you, right? Perhaps. Good, so let's get out of here and start living our lives. That retirement isn't going to enjoy itself, I quipped. Vince cradled me against him and swept us down the hill on our way to a new and better life. I couldn't wait to see what fate had in store for us.